Welcome to the second part of Chapter 6, Population and Community Ecology. This video should be a lot shorter than the last one. I'm so sorry. Sometimes I have lots to say. Okay, let's get started. Yay! If it works. There it goes. So when we're thinking about the distribution of species, how large their habitat dispersion is, how big the ecosystem is, we're going to be thinking about three main factors that are going to be influencing how an area or how an organism spreads out upon an area. One of those is the range of abiotic conditions that it can tolerate. So thinking about earlier this year when we talked about fundamental versus realized niches, those fundamental niches, we're thinking about temperature, I'm thinking about pH, soil fertility, overall water quality. I'm thinking about all the abiotic conditions in the area. And there's only certain ones that organisms are actually able to be sustainable in and can actually tolerate and reproduce and be successful and survive in. So that's going to affect if I am an equatorial bird that only does really well at the equator, I'm not going to survive in Antarctica. So the range that I'm actually able to distribute and immigrate and move around is going to be limited by the temperature of that area. I also want to know the ability to disperse. So birds have wings, right? It's really easy for a bird to get from one ecosystem to another. They just fly away. But a snail, it's a lot more difficult for them to disperse. They can move. However, that mobility is going to be limited by how long they can actually live for. Same thing with certain plant species. Yes, their seeds are going to be dispersed by wind and animals, so that's going to help with that dispersal rate. But one plant is not going to be able to get it from Africa all the way to Antarctica. Well, I guess it could. Anyways, that's a topic for another. But in general, the ability to disperse is going to affect how much they distribute. Also, interactions with other species. If there's a lot of competition, if there's a lot of resource partitioning, which we're going to talk in a little bit, that's also going to affect the actual range of an area that they're actually able to live in. So let's talk about one of those. We're going to be talking about competition first. So when two different organisms are both utilizing the same resources or habitat space or food or water, that's going to result in competition. And there's a principle that relates to competition called the competitive exclusion principle, which essentially means if I have two organisms that use the exact same habitat, they use the exact same resources, one of them is going to be slightly bigger than the other or slightly better than the other. This also kind of relates to natural selection. Who is better able to survive, reproduce, and pass down those genes to future generations of offsprings? So, for example, I have two different parameciums. You might recognize their names from the first Chapter 6 video. But these two parameciums, when it's just by themselves, they're able to grow. We see that logistic S-shaped curve until they reach that carrying capacity K, which is when their growth levels out because they've run out of food, or they've reached the maximum amount of organisms that can be sustained by that given amount of food. However, whenever I grow both of these parameciums in the same area, now I see that competitive exclusion principle. Paramecium Aurelia is slightly better or substantially better at utilizing that food and competing against the other paramecium. And so I see that growth of the orange paramecium until it reaches that carrying capacity, but I see a drop off of our blue paramecium because it's not able to compete and fight for those resources as well as Paramecium Aurelia. That also can relate us into resource partitioning. And we talked about this a little bit in Chapter 5 when we talked about fundamental niche versus realized niche. There could be a large range of seeds or habitat spaces that an organism can use, but depending on how many other predators are also using that same resource or also using that same habitat, that may reduce the actual niche that an organism lives in. We call this resource partitioning. So, for example, I see these two organisms. I have species 1 in blue and species 2 in yellow, and they both can eat a large amount of seeds, but the medium amount of seeds is used by both. While the blue one uses primarily small ones, the yellow species uses primarily or eats primarily large seeds. There is kind of a middle ground. So because both of them, kind of think about that competitive exclusion principle, because both of them can eat these medium-sized seeds, only one of them is actually going to be dominating over the other. Natural selection is going to favor the one that actually does better at adhering and actually gaining these seeds. And so we see in this one that species 1 was better able to outcompete species 2. So species 1, their new range of seeds that they're going to be eating includes these medium seeds, whereas species 2 is outcompeted. Their actual resource has been partitioned to a smaller amount or smaller range of seed sizes because there shouldn't be any overlap. This is our competitive exclusion principle, also known as resource partitioning when we're thinking about how our different resources or habitat sites divvied up between different species. So let's look at some examples of resource partitioning. Now there's three main methods of resource partitioning: temporal resource, spatial resource, and morphological resource partitioning. I'm going to talk about each of them a little bit, but again, last little plug, please make sure you're reading our textbook. These Edpuzzles are really just to get your feet wet, but I want you guys to be reading that textbook to really get kind of some good examples of that. So temporal resource partitioning is whenever individuals are utilizing different times of the day in order to make sure that they're not competing against each other. So some species are active at night, some species are active at twilight, some are good in the morning, some are good in the afternoon. So different individuals will be active at different times of the day. That way they're not overlapping and competing with each other. Spatial resource partitioning is individuals that are using different parts of the area. So in a previous Edpuzzle, we talked about some species, they may be able to access an entire tree. They could live in an entire tree, but different birds or different organisms will utilize and live in different parts of the tree. That way they're not competing with others. So some birds will live in the trunk of the tree. Some will live in the lower canopy. Some will live in the upper canopy, but they'll kind of divvy up the actual space of the area depending on who uses other things best. So the tar bush, it's really good and it has outcompeted the black grama grass. It's able to access and utilize all these layers of soil, and it uses them all very well. And so because of that, it is excluding and partitioning up using all these layers of the soil, whereas the black grama grass is reserved only to the top layer because it is able to sustain itself there, but it's not accessing those lower levels because it's being outcompeted by the tar bush. Finally, morphological resource partitioning. I always think about bird beaks in this one. So some birds, morphology is like body structure. So some animals will have different body structures that makes them better able to resource different resources than others. So for example, some birds will have little skinny beaks. Skinny beaks let them burrow into trees or attack insects, whereas a large broad beak, those are going to be ones for seed crushing. So different animals could have different body structures that allow them to be better able to access some resources in contrast to other resources. All right, we're getting into our different symbiosis. We're talking about, or not symbiosis, I guess symbiosis we're about to get into, but I want to talk a little bit about the relationships two different organisms could have with each other. One of those types of relationships, I think ecological relationships, that's what we're talking about, ecological relationships, one of those being predation. This one I probably don't have to define this part for you, but when one organism is eating or consuming another organism or using is probably the best term for it, using one species by another as a resource, that's going to be predation. Now there's four main types of predation you should be familiar with. One of them is true predators. So a lion hunts a gazelle, eats the gazelle, that is a true predator. I have two animals, one eating the other. Herbivores is whenever it's still predation because it's still consuming something, it's still using one organism as a resource. However, it's not an animal versus an animal. This is an animal attacking or eating or utilizing a plant. So herbivores, I see a rabbit, it's eating grass. That would be an example of herbivores. Parasites are organisms that live on or inside of the organism they consume. So ticks is a great example of parasites where they live on your skin. They're going to be utilizing or sucking your blood. Gross. But that would be an example of parasitism because it's living on. Ringworm, I know, and not mealworm, but ringworm, I know is, and heartworms, that's the other one I was trying to think of, is a parasite that sometimes attacks and lives within dogs or animals. Really sad one. Parasitoids is the nastiest of the nasty. They lay eggs inside of other organisms, and then when those babies hatch, they're going to be hatching out of the organism. Gross, but things you should be familiar with. One of the types of symbiosis relationships where organisms are interacting with one another, and one of them is going to be benefiting. Mutualism, I always think about, like, I don't know, I'm kind of old, but like back in the day, we used to call someone your mutual. Like if you follow them and then they follow you back, I'm like, oh yeah, that's my mutual, because we're both benefiting from that relationship. It's mutually beneficial. Same thing in mutualism and ecology, both species benefit. So I love acacia ants. This is the coolest thing if you haven't heard about it before. Acacia trees and acacia ants have a mutualistic relationship. Acacia ants benefit because they get to live in the tree, they have a habitat, they have food resources, they're able to grow their young within the thorns of the acacia tree, so that is beneficial for the ant. In return, the ants are like literal, like ninja bodyguards for the acacia tree. So anytime an animal tries to be an herbivore and tries to eat the plant, these acacia ants come out and they attack anything that's trying to eat the plant. So this acacia tree literally has bodyguards like built into its thorns, and it's a really cool mutualistic relationship. Commensalism is one where one organism is benefiting, but the other one is neither harmed nor helped. It is neutral. So in this one, I always think about those egrets. I don't know if egrets is the right term, but it's the birds that live on the backs of bison. I feel like hopefully you know what I'm talking about. You've got like the bison, they roam in the fields, they have little birds on their back. The birds are hitching a ride on the bison and they're removing insects and they're eating all the insects that live around the bison. Bison is not affected by this. It's not benefited. It's not being harmed by that. Bison is just kind of there, but the egrets, I'm pretty sure it's egrets. I feel like that's not the right term. Doesn't matter. The bird, though, is getting a free meal by living on the back of this bison. I also think about barnacles on whales. Barnacles are filter feeders, so they need movement. They need that flow of water across them in order to actually have access to floating nutrients in the water. So barnacles on the side of whales, as the whale flows through the ocean, that barnacle is getting that flow of water across it, so it's able to get access to food, but the whales are not harmed and they're not helped by having those barnacles. It's a commensalistic relationship because it is neutral for the other party. Oh, we didn't go over the other one. The other, I guess, predation, we did talk about parasitism. Okay, we did go over them. Cool, so we get to our joke for today. I'm doing no deforestation November. All right, we're going to talk about this a lot in class, but we've talked earlier about trophic cascades. We're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty with this chapter of chapter 6, talking about keystone species. Keystone species are ones that are kind of misleading. They actually play a huge role in a community, more than you might not think. So we usually think about all organisms in an ecosystem have an equal role. They have a part to play. They have a song to sing, right? They're all kind of equally helpful and equally beneficial, but there's some species called keystone species. We'll talk in class about starfish and wolves in Yellowstone. Sorry, the keystone species are going to be ones that actually are kind of holding everything together. And the loss of this organism, everything kind of falls apart in the ecosystem, but regaining that organism in the area can have that ecosystem get back to stability. So these are organisms that are really holding everything together. We're going to talk more in class about keystone species and how they can result in positive and negative trophic cascades. So hold on to that because we got some cool stuff for that. Sorry, my throat is getting really dry. I'm going to try to carry on. Whew, we're almost done though. Primary versus secondary succession. This hopefully should be a review from bio, but just in case you've forgotten this, or maybe you were like sleeping during bio during this part, primary versus secondary succession, I always think, what is our starting material? In general, succession is the revitalization or the comeback of an ecosystem that has been destroyed or disturbed by some sort of natural disaster. So forest fire, a tornado, a flood, a volcano, something has disturbed an ecosystem. Over time, that ecosystem is going to bounce back. But what we're starting with is going to tell me, is it primary versus secondary succession? Primary succession means that I'm starting from scratch. I'm starting in an area that has no soil. So the first thing I have to do, I'm usually starting with rocks. The first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to have pioneer species come in. These are lichens and moss. They can literally live on rocks. These lichens and moss are going to help break down and weather those rocks. And it's also going to be creating organic compounds. And so over time, we're going to be making soil. Crazy stuff. We're making soil. Like, how do you even do that? Lichen and moss know how. So they make soil, then we're able to get into our small plants, then we can get into more complex plants. As we get more and more complex plants, animals start moving into the area, and finally we get to a climax community at the very, very end. But I started with nothing. Primary succession, you start with nothing, you have to create soil first. Secondary succession is slightly less disturbance. So this is something like a forest fire or a flood or a tornado, something that has disturbed the area, but the soil is still there. I still have soil intact. Because of that, we kind of get a head start on this revitalization of the area, this comeback story, because I already made soil. So because I've already made soil, this is usually a shorter process. It can happen within a couple of years versus primary succession, which sometimes can take hundreds of years. So in secondary succession, we're talking about like within a decade or so. Because I already have that soil, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start making small plants, complex plants, animals start moving in. Finally, we get to that climax community. In case, oh, I forgot. I had a case study, but before we get into the case study, we got a joke for you guys. What did the janitor say when he jumped out of the closet? Supplies! Okay, case study of a real-life succession story. The island of Surtsey actually formed off the coast of Iceland in 1963 to 1967 from a volcanic eruption. Whoa, new area. Because it's a volcanic eruption, we're starting with bare rock. This is going to be primary succession. Yay, primary succession. So after the eruption, we see that I have a lot of obsidian. I have a lot of volcanic rock, but I don't see any plants. So the first thing that needed to happen is I first needed to make soil. Over many, many decades, this happened in the 60s. So I'm about to show you guys a photo about 60 years later. Primary succession, again, takes a long time. But Surtsey today is a thriving ecosystem. I still have some rock as well. We're still breaking down that rock. We're still having all my pioneer species. You can actually see some lichen on the rocks in the background. But the lichen is slowly but surely breaking down these rocks, creating soil. The soil can sustain grasses, dandelions, and some small plants. And eventually, we're going to be getting to closer to a climax community off the coast of Iceland. So that's pretty cool. Case study. Yeah, it's real. Okay. Succession can also happen in aquatic ecosystems. So thinking about our intertidal zones, that was one of our biomes, which experiences rapid changes in tides. Hey, intertidal zone. High tide and low tide. As we go high tide, low tide, some of those rocks can actually be overturned. A rock that previously had a lot of life on it can be overturned. Fresh surface of rock can now be susceptible to primary succession. So that's one way that aquatic succession can happen. Also, they can have accumulation and deposition of sediments. So sometimes lakes actually become filled up and covered up. If I have a lot of deposition, if I have a lot of runoff in an area, I could have increasing accumulation of sediments. Over time, those can build up until eventually my aquatic ecosystem is now terrestrial. And now I have grass, and it's still a little bit like spongy. So maybe it's closer to like a bog or something like that. But I am getting closer and closer to a climax terrestrial community. Sorry, sometimes my brain just like shuts down. The good news is you got 2 more slides. Last 2. Kind of tackling everything back to our populations. We were thinking about the number and types of species present. Hint, 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 this is our species richness, right? The number and types of species present are going to be determined by 3 basic processes. 1, the colonization of the area by new species. I might have a lot of rich biodiversity in an area, a whole bunch of organisms, but if I have new organisms coming in, these, we think about invasive species, they're invading, coming into an area where they previously were not. Invasive species could be competitors. They could outcompete my native organisms in that area, and that's going to reduce the biodiversity in the area. It could reduce the number of organisms in that area. My number and types of species can also be affected by the rate of speciation within the area. How fast is that rate of evolution? Speciation, remember, is the creation of new species. So that rate of the creation of new species, that rate of evolution in an area, kind of makes sense, is going to affect the actual number of species. If I have a high rate of evolution, we're popping off new species here, there, and everywhere, I'm going to have a huge gain in number of species in that area. Additionally, the loss of the area by extinction, this is also going to affect the number of organisms in my area as we lose organisms. Last slide. The factors that are going to determine species richness, so kind of similar to what we were talking about, the number is determined by these, but also the factors that continually affect that amount of species in an area. One is going to be latitude. So our equatorial areas are usually going to have a wider range of abiotic factors that a lot of organisms are able to live in. Warm temperatures, high precipitation, versus my extremes of latitude. So my North Pole, my South Pole has a lot harsher conditions. So because it's very harsh conditions, they're going to have a low number of species, a low species richness. Additionally, time. Older ecosystems are going to have a greater amount of biodiversity, a greater amount of species richness as compared to younger species. This makes sense. An older community is going to be one that's had lots and lots of reproductive cycles, which means lots of mutation, which means lots of speciation, creation of new species. So it checks that they would have a greater amount of species in that area. Habitat size, we've talked about this earlier. Large habitat sizes means that I have a lot of organisms in the area. If I have a lot of organisms, I have a huge variety of biodiversity within the genetic side. And so if I have a lot of traits, that can then increase evolutionary rates in that area. And so that can affect how many species are in that area. Finally, the distance from other communities. If I have a very isolated area, that means I'm only relying on, let's say, like mutations to really kind of have that rate of speciation in the area, versus if I have a population that's really close to other populations, especially something like, well, never mind. So if I have a population that's close to a lot of other populations, then I can experience that gene flow, genes flowing into and out of an area. That's also going to affect species richness because I'm having new traits added into the area. You made it to the end. Our riddle for today is I have keys, but no locks, and space, but no rooms. You can enter, but you can't go outside. What am I? Oh, somebody riddles. I hope that you guys have an amazing day. I think that you all are awesome, and I will see you guys in class. Thank you.